For my reconstruction of a panel painting in egg tempera, I chose to reproduce the Madonna and Child by a follower from Filippo, Lippi, and Pesellino. Created circa 1470, this tempera piece is on a poplar panel support and is part of the Widener collection at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In this video, I will be going through my entire process of reconstructing the panel, beginning with a trip to the National Gallery of Art in late August. In early September, we began preparing our panels. After the initial rabbit skin glue layer and approximately 13 coats of gesso, a mix of the rabbit skin glue and chalk, I began to sand down my panel, first using a relatively fine sandpaper grain. I then added about 3 additional layers of rabbit skin glue applied with a cloth-like wipe in an attempt to further soften and prepare the panel in experimentation. However, it was still not as smooth as I hoped, which led me to using a coarser pumice stone, followed by a much softer cuttlebone. Both of these were used to smooth and soften the surface and edges of my panel. Then it came time to transfer my image onto the panel. After making tracing paper using pigment and a solvent, I placed the paper face down on my panel, placing the cropped image on top and taped it on one side. At first I taped it to the top, then moved it to the sides. This allowed me to check my progress by flipping the image and tracing paper up every once in a while. I outlined the major lines down to even some of the smallest details using a rounded stylus. By tracing over the image with the tracing paper underneath, the pigment was then transferred onto the panel without me having to try to freehand the entire painting. After the image was traced with the red pigment, it was then time to begin inking. Mixing ink and water to create a very light black and taking a fine-tip pen, I began the arduous process of outlining the tracing with ink. I didn't have very good control over the pen tip at times, causing the ink to splatter out in little dots across a few areas. Then it came time to think about the gilding. I began with painting 3 layers of gold along the areas where sheets of gold leaf would be applied. Then, before placing any precious gold down, we tried a few different ways of experimenting with the gold leaf, although none seemed to work as well as we had hoped. Ultimately, we found rabbit skin glue to be a sufficient binding to the gold leaf. Letting the glue dry until tacky, sheets of gold were placed over the glue and then peeled away. However, as mentioned, it still had its issues. It was inconsistent at times, necessitating patch jobs using a bit of a cheat, gold sizing and placing down more gold leaf, and the gold scratched easily in any attempt to burnish. I then went in with gold sizing in order to lay down a gold powder on the very detailed areas of the Madonna's robes. After waiting about an hour for the gold sizing to dry, I then dusted the powder over places where the sizing had been painted on, and brushed any excess gold powder off, revealing this less shiny gold detailing. I will say that I wish I had used a smaller brush, or at least been more mindful that the gold sizing tended to spread out, which made the resulting gold areas a lot bigger than they are on the actual painting. Then I moved on to the actual painting process. Before I get into the underdrawing, I wanted to first mention the pigments I used throughout the reconstruction process. In no particular order, I used Terra Vert, Terra Rosa, Titanium White, Raw Sienna, Ultramarine Blue, Ivory Black, Yellow Ochre, Raw Umber, Burnt Umber, Chromium Oxide Green, and Burnt Sienna. A typical painting day in the studio began by gathering all the materials I needed, retrieving my panel from my drawer and bringing it to the work table, tearing off a sheet of brown paper to place under everything in case of any messes, and of course preparing the egg medium. To make the egg tempera medium, you need to crack an egg, discarding any egg white while keeping the yolk intact. Then you want to skillfully pierce the yolk and let the egg drain into a dish for use, making sure not to get any yolk sac in the dish. You then add equal parts water to the egg yolk and mix, producing the egg medium, which could then be mixed with pigment. In preparing the paint, I would add onto my glass palette some egg medium, a bit of water, and the pigment. I used a palette knife to smoothen out the pigment and try to get rid of any graininess in it. With my palette ready to go, I began working on the underdrawing of the painting with purposefully transparent paint. I first painted transparent Terra Vert in place of flesh tones, then added transparent Terra Rosa in place of the blue sky. I continued the underdrawing with putting some raw sienna under the Madonna's dress, building up a bit of that tone, but I then struggled with what to do next, anxious about starting the skin tone, so I made the decision to work on some of the white areas and white detailing. Mostly this meant the headpiece, along with a bit of the detail along her robes. So at first I struggled with building up the titanium white. It came off as a very reddish orange color, and not the more transparent white I was looking for. In retrospect, the off-white color was probably due to one of two things. First, the leftover red pigment on the panel from tracing the image, or second, getting a tint of the yellow hue of the egg yolk. However, I noticed that with subsequent layers, that color seemed to go away and the white became stronger, which leads me to believe it was the leftover tracing paper pigment. Nonetheless, I built up layers of white and began a bit of apprehensive shading along the headpiece. At this point, I was finishing the underdrawing by adding some terra rosa under the flower stems and leaves and started to develop color, starting with a terra vert and terra rosa. So I added some terra rosa to the cheeks and lips and did a bit of shading along the flesh with the terra vert. I also started building up the color for the flower leaves and stems, again going in with the terra vert for that green color. However, as I was doing that and going through the terra vert on the flower stems and the leaves, I noticed that the green pigment was very grainy, and unfortunately I didn't notice that until I was already painting, even after I had gone over the pigment with the palette knife and molded it. So you can see some of that graininess on the panel itself. Then I went in with the ultramarine blue, and initially I was having some trouble covering the raw sienna of the underdrawing, although on camera it looks a bit better. And I also went in with the ultramarine blue and started painting over the terra rosa in the background to build up that blue color of the sky. Developing color was definitely not my strong suit. I struggled quite a bit to find the correct values and tones of thin layers of transparent paint. This, in turn, led to a lot of experimentation, especially as I worked by myself in the studio with no one to gather advice from. I tended to go too dark in color, like the blue background or even the skin tone later on. Then I struggled to lighten it, which led me to a few problems. The flesh tone was an especially difficult obstacle to cross. I began by adding layers of very light pink, a mix of titanium white and terra rosa, until I started to see a color resembling flesh. However, the flesh came out too tan in comparison to the source image. So again, I tried a few different colors and tones in comparison and in experimentation. I tried going in with white, raw sienna, more terra rosa, and combinations of all three, which has now left the flesh looking rather ghastly, and not exactly the pale color that I was going for. I also ended up using additional layers of transparent titanium white to lighten the blue background, which I think has taken on a more accurate color. Before I get into a final comparison between my progress and the source image, I compiled photographs taken throughout the process and put them together into a brief time-lapse in order to better see the progress of individual steps in my reconstruction. Now we turn to the final comparison of my egg tempera reconstruction of Madonna and Child as of October 6th, 2019. Although my panel is not complete, I hope to keep working on it until the end of the semester, hopefully improving on the accuracy of my reproduction. First, a final look at my panel itself. For a first attempt at egg tempera painting from someone with no experience, I am extremely pleased with the result. Working with a new medium in an indirect painting method was challenging, leading to a lot of experimentation in methods and techniques. Finally, a side-by-side comparison of my panel on the left and the cropped image of Madonna and Child, courtesy of the National Gallery of Art, on the right.